The Lighthouse Keeper and the Mermaid. Chapter 1. The Light on the Cliff. Long ago, on a rugged coast where the sea whispered to ancient cliffs, there stood a lighthouse. Every night, its beams swept slowly across the dark waters, guiding sailors safely home. Beside the lighthouse stood a small stone cottage. Its windows glowed with a warm, golden light that could be seen from the fishing village below. The villagers often looked toward that light before going to sleep. It reassured them. As long as the lighthouse shone, all was well. The keeper of the lighthouse was an old man named Thomas. Nobody knew exactly how old he was. The oldest fishermen remembered him from their childhood. Even their parents had known him. Thomas had become part of the landscape itself, as familiar as the cliffs and the sea. Yet in recent years, people saw him less and less. He rarely came down to the village. Sometimes entire months passed without anyone catching sight of him. The villagers wondered if he was lonely. Some feared he might be ill. But the lighthouse always shone on time. And every evening the warm light appeared in the cottage windows. So life continued. Among the villagers lived a young woman named Eliza. She loved stories, especially stories about the sea. As a child, she had spent countless evenings listening to her grandmother tell tales beside the fire. Stories of hidden islands, stories of enchanted seals, stories of moonlit ships that sailed between worlds, and stories of mermaids. Most people eventually outgrew such tales. Eliza never quite did. Whenever she walked along the shore, she found herself looking toward the horizon, wondering what secrets might lie beyond it. One calm autumn evening, she set out for a walk along the cliffs. The sky glowed in shades of violet and deep blue. The sea reflected the fading light like polished glass. Everything felt unusually still. Then she noticed movement below. Something, or someone, was emerging from the water. A young woman climbed gracefully across the rocks. Her silver hair shimmered in the moonlight. Her flowing dress seemed woven from sea mist itself. Eliza stood frozen. The stranger moved toward the lighthouse. As she reached the cottage, the door opened. Thomas stood waiting. The old lighthouse keeper smiled, not politely, not formally, but with the happiness of someone greeting a beloved friend. The young woman smiled back, then they embraced. The cottage door closed, and Eliza's curiosity began. That night, she quietly approached the cottage and looked through a gap in the curtains. Inside, she saw something she never expected. Not magic, not treasure, not secrets, only peace. The old keeper and the mysterious visitor sat beside the fire, sharing tea and quiet conversation. They seemed completely content simply to be together, and somehow that mystery felt deeper than any spell. For the first time, Eliza wondered whether the greatest magic in the world might not be power at all. Perhaps it was companionship. Perhaps it was love. Yet she still wanted answers, and so the next evening she visited her grandmother. The old woman listened carefully. When Eliza finished speaking, her grandmother sat silently for a long time. Then she nodded. "There was an old story," she said. "A story my grandmother once told me." "What story?" asked Eliza. "The story of a storm." And thus the tale truly began. Chapter 2. The Storm and the Sea. More than 60 years earlier, Thomas had not been an old man. He had been young, strong, adventurous, and newly appointed keeper of the lighthouse. In those days, he spent every spare moment exploring the coastline. He loved the sea. Not because it was gentle, but because it was honest. The sea could be calm. The sea could be fierce, but it never pretended to be anything else. One winter evening, a terrible storm arrived. Dark clouds swallowed the sky. Rain lashed the cliffs. Waves crashed against the rocks with tremendous force. The villagers remained safely indoors, but Thomas stayed awake in the lighthouse. The beacon had to shine. Ships depended upon it. Hour after hour, he watched the storm. Then, shortly after midnight, he saw something impossible. A flash of silver among the waves. At first he thought it was debris from a shipwreck, yet the shape moved. Again he saw it, and again. Without hesitation, Thomas grabbed a lantern and rushed into the storm. The wind nearly knocked him from his feet. Spray drenched his coat. Still, he continued downward toward the rocks. There, trapped between two crashing waves, lay a young woman. Her eyes were closed. Her silver hair spread across the stones. Thomas carried her back to the lighthouse. He wrapped her in blankets. He kept the fire burning through the night. And just before dawn, she opened her eyes. They were unlike any eyes he had ever seen. Their color shifted like sunlight beneath clear water. "Where am I?" she whispered. "In the lighthouse," Thomas replied. "You were caught in the storm." The young woman smiled faintly. "Then you saved me." For several days she remained in the cottage. She introduced herself as Marina. She spoke little about herself. Whenever Thomas asked where she came from, she simply smiled. From far away. Yet despite her mystery, they became friends. They spoke for hours. About books, about stars, about the sea, about dreams. Thomas discovered he never grew tired of her company, and Marina seemed equally happy to spend time with him. One evening, as they stood outside watching the sunset, Marina finally shared her secret. "You must promise not to be afraid." Thomas laughed. "I don't think I could ever be afraid of you." Marina smiled. Then she stepped toward the water. As moonlight touched the waves, something extraordinary happened. For a brief moment, Thomas saw her true form. The sea itself seemed to embrace her. Silver scales shimmered beneath the water. And suddenly he understood. The stories were true. Marina was a mermaid. Thomas expected to feel shock. Instead, he felt wonder. And strangely, relief. At last, the mystery made sense. "I suppose," he said softly. "That explains why you enjoy the ocean so much." Marina laughed. The sound echoed across the water, and from that night onward, their friendship deepened. Chapter 3: The Promise. Years passed. Seasons came and went. The lighthouse continued to shine, and Marina returned whenever she could. Sometimes weeks would pass between visits, sometimes months. The sea had responsibilities of its own. Marina often spoke of distant waters, of whales older than kingdoms, of coral cities hidden beneath moonlit waves, of places no human had ever seen. Yet she always returned to the lighthouse, and Thomas always waited. As the years unfolded, their friendship slowly became something deeper, something impossible to name, something neither of them needed to explain. One evening they sat together watching the sunset. The sky glowed gold and crimson. "I wish time moved more slowly," Thomas said. Marina looked at him quietly, for mermaids experience time differently. The years touched them lightly. Humans were different. She could already see silver appearing in Thomas's hair. "You will grow old," she said softly. "Yes. And one day," Thomas nodded, "one day." Silence settled between them. Finally, Marina reached for his hand. "Then let us make a promise." "What kind of promise?" "No matter how many years pass, no matter what happens, I will return." Thomas smiled. "And I will wait." The promise was simple, yet it carried them through decades. Thomas grew older. His hair turned white. His steps became slower. The village changed. Children grew up. New families arrived. Old friends passed away. But the lighthouse remained, and Marina returned again and again. Whenever she entered the cottage, Thomas's eyes brightened. Whenever she laughed, the years seemed lighter. Whenever she sat beside him, he felt young again. Not in body, but in spirit. And perhaps that matters more. Outside, the lighthouse beam swept gently across the sea. Inside, the cottage glowed warmly against the darkness, and far below, the waves sang their endless song. Years later, when Eliza became old herself, she often told children about the lighthouse. Not all of the story, only enough. She would point toward the cliff where the beacon still shone. And she would say, "Some people believe the greatest treasures are gold and jewels." Then she would smile. "But the sea taught me otherwise. The greatest treasure is having someone who always finds their way back to you." And on certain quiet nights, when the moon painted a silver path across the water, some villagers claimed they could see a graceful figure dancing among the waves. Whether that was true, nobody could say, but the lighthouse continued to shine. The cottage windows continued to glow, and somewhere between the sea and the stars, a promise endured. A promise stronger than time, a promise carried by the waves. And if you listen carefully on a calm night, you may still hear the ocean whispering their story.